Welcome to episode 146 of Real Health Radio. You can find the links talked about as part of this episode at the show notes. So www.7, so the word all spelled out, SEVEN health.com/146. Over the last handful of weeks, I've been starting the podcast by mentioning I'm taking on new clients. And client work is the foundation of my business and the thing I enjoy the most. And after working with clients for the last decade, I feel confident in saying I'm very good at what I do. And when I reflect on all the clients I've worked with over the last couple of years, there are a handful of topics that are my area of expertise or specialty areas. One of the biggest is helping women to get their periods back, so recovery from hypothalamic amenorrhea or HA. And this is often a result of undereating and overexercising and is almost always coupled with body dissatisfaction or fear of gaining weight. So the work with these kinds of clients, as with really all clients, is a mix of understanding physiology and how to support the body, but also being compassionate and understanding psychology and uncovering the whys behind these clients' behavior and figuring out how to change this. I've recently had one client get her period back after it being absent for 20 years, and in the same week had another client had her first period in 10 years. I also work to help clients who are disordered eaters or have previously been diagnosed with an eating disorder. And with these clients, there are symptoms that occur very commonly. So water retention, poor digestion, always cold, peeing all the time, often waking multiple times in the night to urinate, no periods or bad PMS symptoms, low energy, poor sleep, low thyroid. There's also common mental and emotional symptoms. So a compulsion to exercise, fear of certain foods, whether that be certain macronutrients or whether that be certain amounts of foods, anxiety, low mood or depression, poor body image, fear of gaining weight. And with these clients, it's using that same mix of understanding science and compassion to help them recover. And I know that full recovery is possible. And I've had many clients who've had multiple stays in inpatient facilities where nothing worked. And then they get to a place where they're now fully recovered. The final area is helping clients transition out of dieting and learning to listen to their body. So they've had years or decades of dieting and nothing worked. Like they know it's a failed endeavor, but they are struggling to figure out how to eat when they're not dieting. So how do they listen to their body? What should they be eating? They're confused, they're overwhelmed. And with this work, it's this combination of using intuitive eating and non-diet approach, my nutrition understanding, and being able to guide clients towards interoceptive awareness, amongst other things, that helps them put an end to their dieting habits and truly know how to nourish and look after their body. So it's these kind of clients that make up the bulk of my practice. And I'm very good at helping them get to a place with their food and with their body and even their life in general that they think is impossible. So if any of these scenarios sound like you and you'd like help, please get in contact. You can head over to www.7-health.com/help, so HELP. And there you can read about how I work with clients and apply for a free initial chat.
Welcome to Real Health Radio. Health advice that's more than just about how you look. And here's your host, Chris Sandel.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Real Health Radio. Thanks for joining me again. So before I jump into this week's episode, I just want to mention two things. So one is that I got some really lovely emails and comments from people based on last week's episode. So last week was a solo show where I went through what I do in a day, and it really just seemed to resonate with people. So if you haven't listened to that one, then please check it out. The other thing I want to mention is that I made a video this week that went out on Tuesday. This is the first time I've made a video in a while, probably a couple of years, or at least it feels that long. And the video looks at calories and what the body actually needs to function properly. So many people that I work with and those who get in contact with me are confused and are under the wrong impression about this, and it's leading to them eating in a way that is not supporting their body and not taking in enough fuel to support all the functions that the body has to do. And again, I got many positive comments and emails from those who watched the video. So if you haven't watched that, I'll put a link to it in the show notes so you can check it out. Or you can go to my website, 7-health.com, and it's on the homepage. It's called Understanding Calorie Requirements. So those are the two bits of housekeeping. So let's just get on with today's show. It's a guest interview, and I'm speaking with Emily Nagoski. Emily began her career as a sex educator, focusing not only on sex, but on stress and nutrition and physical activity and preventing sexual violence. She went to Indiana University for a MS in counseling psychology, completing clinical internships at the Kinsey Institute Sexual Health Clinic and the IU GLBT Student Supportive Services Office. She earned a Ph.D. in health behavior with a concentration in human sexuality. She taught graduate and undergraduate classes in human sexuality, relationships and communication, stress management, and sex education. For 8 years, she worked as a lecturer and director of wellness education at Smith College before transitioning to full-time writing and speaking. She now travels all over the world, training professionals, teaching college students and other lay people, and learning more every day about the science and art of sexual wellbeing. She is a trained Gottman Seven Principles educator with extensive specialized training in bystander intervention, motivational interviewing, and cultural inclusivity, including race, gender, and class. Emily's mission in life is to teach women to live with confidence and joy inside their bodies. So Emily is someone I've wanted to have on the podcast for a while. If you are a regular listener of the show and listen to my end of year episode about my favorite books and documentaries and podcasts, you may recognize her name. She wrote Come As You Are, which is or was or is one of my favorite books from last year, and it's all about sexual well-being. She's also recently written a book called Burnout, which comes out in the next couple of weeks and is about stress. And to quote the website, it's for women who feel overwhelmed and exhausted by all they have to do, yet worrying they're not doing enough. So this episode is predominantly about the first book, but Emily does cover both of them as part of the conversation. So some of the things that we cover are the dual control mechanism for sexual desire or sexual arousal. Basically, there is a brake and an accelerator, and she talks about this. Why calling sex a drive is a problem. And this is something that I've done many, many times before, but she explains why it's not a drive, why this isn't the case, and why thinking about it as a drive can be problematic. We talk about how stress impacts on sex and on arousal, and Emily goes through some really helpful information about completing the cycle with the stress response and why this is so important. We go through arousal non-concordance. And this is hands down the thing that is most mentioned from clients when I suggest that they read this book, just because no one is talking about this. And lots more. Emily was a great guest, and there is so much content in this episode. Personally, I felt like I was a little flat. I listened back to the show like I do with all of them, and I feel fairly pedestrian. I guess sometimes we just have our off days, but Emily more than makes up for this. So that's it for the intro. Let's get on with the show. This is my conversation with Emily Nagoski. Hey, Emily, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So I listed your book, Come As You Are, as one of my favorite books of last year, and I think it came out in 2015, but I only got round to reading it last year. And when I was describing your book as part of my end of year roundup, I said that you have this end goal of promoting women's sexual well-being, but through that lens, you just bring so much information. So you cover anatomy, evolutionary biology, feminism, health at every size, attachment styles, trauma, breathwork, etc. And it's this long list of divergent ideas that you then funnel through this concept of women's sexual well-being. And I'd say not just women, but men too. I found the book immensely helpful from the angle of like client work that I do, but also in my own life and relationships and how I understand the world. So what I'm hoping as part of our time together is to really share your breadth of knowledge, because there is so much that people don't know that's in your book, and equally there's so much incorrect information that needs correcting from your book. So yeah, really, I think your book is going to be the source material for my questions, with the intentions of giving people a taste of what's on offer. And this isn't going to be a substitute for, I don't know, a 300 odd page book, but we can just see what we can cover in our brief time together. So that's just a basic frame for today.
Fantastic.
And so as a starting place, do you want to give a bit of background on yourself? So maybe a brief bio, educational background, what you've done up until this point?
Sure. I started out as a sex educator as an undergraduate. I was a big nerd my whole life. So by the time I got to college, I knew I'd be going to grad school for something. I had no idea what. But because I was in college, I was like, okay, so I need some volunteer work on my resume to make me look like a good grad school candidate 4 years from now. And so I asked the people who lived on my floor in my residence hall. And one of the guys was pre-med. And he said, hey, come be a peer health educator with me. And I was like, I like health? Sure. So I applied and I interviewed and I got accepted, and I started being trained to go into residence halls to talk about condoms, contraception, and consent were the big three, but also stress and sleep and nutrition and physical activity. And though my degree is in psychology with minors in philosophy and cognitive science, and I had this plan to be a clinical neuropsychologist working with people with traumatic brain injury or stroke, I loved the academic work I was doing, but when I was doing this volunteer work as a health educator, a sex educator, and then ultimately as a sexual violence prevention educator and crisis responder, doing that made me like who I am as a person in a way that the intellectual stuff just never could. And so that's the path I chose. I went to Indiana University for grad school. I got a master's degree in counseling psychology with a focus in sex therapy. I did my clinical internship at the Kinsey Institute and realized in that process that I am not a by nature. I'm not a therapist by temperament. I am an educator. But I'm also a woman who likes to be in charge of things, so I needed a Ph.D. So I stayed in school, I stayed at IU, and I got a Ph.D. in health behavior, which is basically public health, again with the concentration in human sexuality. And ultimately, shortly thereafter, ended up as the director of wellness education at Smith College. Smith is a small liberal arts women's college in Western Massachusetts, which, if you've ever seen the movie White Christmas,
I don't know if I have. Maybe I did when I was a kid. When did it come out?
Yeah, like 1952.
Okay, possibly then.
It's a Bing Crosby, Danny Kaye musical.
Okay. Musicals were never a big thing for me.
Well, in this movie in 1952, Danny Kaye is trying to convince Bing Crosby to date these two women. And Danny Kaye says, okay, so maybe they're not the best and the brightest. They didn't go to Smith, that's the school that I worked at.
Okay.
It's the alma mater of Gloria Steinem and Betty Friedan and Catherine McKinnon and Julia Child and all these women who are really iconic in America. And so it's 2,500. Almost all women, some trans students also. And I was teaching a class called Women's Sexuality there, along with doing a bunch of other things that we can talk about. And so I teach the first class, and it's the anatomy class, just as the first chapter in the book is the anatomy chapter. That's just where you start. And a student raises her hand and says, Emily, can you explain the evolutionary origin of the hymen? And I had been a sex educator for 15 years by then, right? And I had never wondered even about the evolutionary origin of the hymen, much less ever learned what it was. So I knew on that day this was not going to be an ordinary semester, and it was not. The students and I kicked each other's asses all semester, digging really deep into all that stuff you were talking about, the evolutionary biology and attachment theory and all the science of sexuality that busts these long-standing, really damaging myths about how sexuality works. And so on the final exam, my last question was, just tell me one important thing you learned out of all this science. You get the 2 points no matter what you say. The 2 points matters a lot to the students. And I thought they were going to say the evolutionary biology, the attachment theory, the arousal non-concordance. But instead, more than half of my students just wrote something like, I learned I'm normal. I'm normal. Just because I'm different from other women doesn't mean there's anything wrong with me. Just because I'm different from my partner doesn't mean there's anything wrong with me. I can trust my body. So I was grading final exams in my office with tears in my eyes, reading these answers and feeling like something really important had happened in that class. And that was the day I decided to write Come As You Are. 5 years later, it got published. and now here I am. The book was so successful that I left Smith and now travel full-time training college students and medical professionals and therapists and anyone who will listen, basically, about the science of women's sexual well-being and more globally about women's overall well-being, since the best predictor of a woman's sexual well-being is her overall well-being.
And so given all of that and where you are now, like if we went back to your childhood, would you say you grew up in a sex-positive household?
Oh, God, no.
Okay.
No, everything about, I actually just listened to your conversation with Christy Harrison. And so, like, you ask one question in that, which is basically, tell me about your relationship with food as a child. And so I was thinking about, like, my origins around sexuality and my body and everyone's bodies in my household. And I never got, like, the talk. My parents never sat us down and I have an identical twin sister, so I say we a lot about our growing up because it would be done together. Instead, there were medical textbooks, medical encyclopedias in the house, and I learned about sex by reading these medical encyclopedias and medical textbooks. And that's it. There was literally zero conversation that happened in my house.
So you ending up in science side of things, no real surprise. You ending up as a sex therapist and everything else along those lines is more of a surprise.
Actually, the science part's surprising, too. I come from a family of artists. My father's a photographer. My mother is a singer and pianist. My sister is a choral conductor. My brother is an ethnomusicologist.
Okay.
And then there's me. So I'm the black sheep with my like Ph.D. and my sciencey nerdiness and my sexuality stuff. Yeah.
And I was just wondering, and this is more just out of interest, it's fairly common when you meet someone at a party or in a social situation to be asked, like, what do you do? Like, when you tell someone what you do, is the response that it just shuts down conversation and people move on to a different topic, or you then just get this barrage of questions with lots of, oh, my friend has this thing going on type questions?
Yeah, it does not shut down conversation in my experience. Mostly people get instantly curious, but they don't even know what question to ask. They don't even know where to start. So they often ask me, so what's the question you get asked most often? Or what's the strangest question you've ever been asked? And want me to talk about basically sort of like the freaky weirdness that they assume comes with being a sex educator.
And so you alluded earlier on to like the this is normal, and this is something that gets repeated again and again in the book. Mm-hmm. And there's a number of phrases that you repeat in the book, and for good reason, because you really want them to sink in. And another one that you talk about, and it comes pretty early on and then kind of all throughout the book, is all the same parts organized in different ways.
Yep.
Yes. Can you just elaborate on this and what it means, but also why you think it's so important?
So important that I say it over and over, literally in every chapter in the book.
Exactly.
You can tell by my writing that I'm a teacher first and a writer second. As an educator, I know that spaced repetition is how people learn things. which is not how you're supposed to write a book, but it's how I wrote Come As You Are because I'm a teacher. And it worked because, see, you got it.
It does work. And I would say that I can tell you are a teacher, and not kind of dismissing you as a writer, but I can tell you are a teacher because of the way that you write. And
Yes.
it sinks in.
Which means you only have to read it once. So it ultimately saves you time. So what all the same parts organized in different ways means is that everyone's sexuality is made of the same basic components, and those parts are organized in different ways. There's a conversation that happens about like men's sexuality versus women's sexuality. Are we the same or are we different? And the answer is yes. We're all made of the same parts, just organized in different ways. And the most literal way to understand this is to think about the structure of our genitals. On the body arrangement that when a person is born, most of the time, the adults instantly declare it's a boy or it's a girl. And if a person has the it's a boy organization of genitals, there's going to be a thing on that person's body that is stretchy, where hair is going to grow. And that's the scrotum, we call it, on that body. And if a person has the it's a girl collection, then there's a part on that person's body that's stretchy, where hair is going to grow. In the uterus, as those body parts are developing, we call that the labioscrotal tissue because it's the same parts. But around week 6 of gestation, there's a wash of hormones. And depending on what the individual's genetics are, the hormones cause those body parts to organize in a different way. It's all the same prefabricated hardware right there, but the way the parts get organized is just a little bit different. If you look at a scrotum up close and personal, you'll see that there's a seam running down the middle of it, and that's actually where the scrotum sort of like knit up together. And if just a little bit had been different about the hormonal environment or the genetics in utero, that's where that person's body would have developed labia instead of a scrotum. Literally all the same parts, just organized in different ways. They're called biological homologs, having the same origin. And you can find a homolog for every part, the clitoris and the penis, the labia and the scrotum, ovaries and testicles is the one we all know about. So literally all the same parts organized in different ways when it comes to our genitals, when it comes to It's a Boy and It's a Girl organizations, but also all of the It's a Girls and It's a Boys are all different from each other. Every person who has the It's a Girl combination of genitals, their genitals are different from everybody else's. And they are all beautiful. They are all healthy and normal as long as there's no pain or infection. There's nothing you need to change about it. There's nothing wrong with any of those bodies. But then it's not just the organization of our anatomical parts. There's also the mechanism in our brain that governs sexual response. It's called the dual control mechanism. And it's called the dual control mechanism because there's two parts.